Hello, everybody. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock. This is Starfleet Tactical. I'm Chris Weuve, and I'm here with frequent guest Peter Gold, just back from doing the Merchant Mariner thing. So how much about your trip do you want to talk about, Peter?
I got to see my daughter and my grandson. And other than that, it was busy, a lot of work.
So Peter is a merchant marine engineer by trade, which means that he doesn't get to see the sun much.
Yes, I'm allergic to that burning thing in the sky.
Did you know that? And this may have been somebody pulling my leg, but I'm told that there is a tradition in the Army that the senior person present when a group of them goes outdoors is supposed to say hi to the sun.
Had not heard that one.
And which they call Bob, big orange ball. they'll just walk out and they'll say, one of them will look up and say, "Hi, Bob." And I have I'm still trying to decide if they're pulling my leg on that one or not.
From the Army, they may not be. I don't know. But I will look through my foster mother's dissertation for World War II Merchant Marine ethnography and see if there's anything like that.
I'm going to go. There are some Army people I can ask about that. So I'll probably go off and do that. So there was an interesting conversation taking place in the text chat about the commissioning of the USS New Jersey, a Virginia-class submarine, SSN something or another. I forget what her hull number is. And I need to double check and see whether they're starting to build the extended length New Virginias yet. But I got to do a tour of a Virginia. I think it was New Hampshire stands out for some reason. That was about 10 years ago now, probably more than 10 years. It was one of the early ones. And it was a seriously cool boat. Although in all honesty, the inside of a submarine, a modern submarine looks like the inside of a modern submarine. When I was not in the control room, everything else looked pretty much the same. It's just, things were in a different location, but it had the same decor, etc. Control room was very noticeably different. And as I've said on this show before, if you want to have an understanding about how the Virginia-class submarine control room works, you should read the Star Trek Next Generation technical manual. And I'm not kidding. Because they have basically something that looks a lot like con and ops at the front, where they, rather than having relatively junior sailors doing the planes and the rudder, they have actually fairly senior sailors doing it, like senior chiefs and senior chiefs doing it. And Wright says it's a Block 4. I can't remember if Block 4 is when they started putting in the extended length bit. So I've got some research to do. But so let's see. Anything else we should talk about before we launch into tonight's topic?
Had to be careful choosing what I wore today. I have too many shirts that have my employer or past employers on them, so I had to make sure I wasn't talking for any employer, past, future, or present.
That's a thank you very much for reminding me. I haven't done very many shows recently, and that trend unfortunately is going to continue, that I forget to do that. But Lissa, who is behind the scenes, immediately jumped on that grenade. Go, Lissa. So I also am not speaking.
I know what I'm doing when producing, my guy.
So I also am not speaking for any employer, past, present, or future. So, I guess I could be speaking for a future employer. I don't know yet. But chances are low. And Pat is out flying around. I think Pat actually has, if I remember correctly, this is the weekend he has off. It's like the only weekend this month he has off. And for some strange reason, he decided to spend it with his wife instead of with us. And so I think that's where he is right now. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and launch the slides. So we're going to talk about capital ships, and this was sort of a tough one to do. because it's sort of I pulled in an article from a guy named Michael Vlahos, and I'll talk a little bit about him. But it's a little bit weird. The article's a little weird, and I couldn't quite capture the quirky flavor of it, but I'll try. And it's more like a guidelines for a discussion. Hey, Alyssa, just to let you know, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do that. Which is a format. Yeah. She just gave me a thumbs up behind the scenes. That's a layout that I put together to bring up the people a little bit bigger. And so here's the mostly Chris-centric schedule coming up for the next few months. And you'll see there's an awful lot of red, and there's a few things that have changed since last week. Like I am definitely not going to be available next week because on Friday I'm going to leave town. I wasn't sure if I was going to leave sometime between Friday and Monday, and the answer is going to be Friday. The following week after that, I'm just hard down at a science fiction convention. Then I'm back for a week, and then it's probably no on the 12th because I'm probably I'm almost certainly going to be at Traveler Con in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, talking about the role-playing game Traveler with people, which you may recall I've got listed there as one of the things that I want to talk about, navies and Traveler. And then the rest of the schedule, like I'm going to be out of town for basically 3 weeks, of which 1 week is going to be in Des Moines. I'll probably do a show in Des Moines. That's on the 9th, but the 2 weekends before that. In fact, I'll actually be working on the 26th of October because I'm going off to do a war game, and we're working on Saturday. So there's a very good chance that when the show would normally be on, I will actually be working at that time. So that's kind of what's going on there. Okay, so tonight we're going to look at the concept of a capital ship, and I'm going to kind of do it at least a little bit through the lens of an article from a guy named Michael Vlahos, and I'll tell you who Michael Vlahos is in just a second, called A Crack in the Shield, the Capital Ship Concept Under Attack. And he wrote this in 1979. Unfortunately, the article's behind a paywall. I went looking for it. I couldn't find it any place except for behind the paywall. I actually paid for it because I read it when I was in graduate school, I think. And then I decided to go get an electronic copy of it. So it's a quirky little article. And keep in mind the context. The context is 1979. So this is before they brought back the battleships. This is before... before China was a big deal in terms of building ships. There's a lot of other things that sort of put that article sort of firmly in the 1970s, but it still has some interesting things in there. And so the rough agenda is I'm going to talk, Peter and I are going to talk about my definition of a capital ship, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about a little bit of the history, et cetera, et cetera. And this is actually really more a list of the topics we're going to talk about as opposed to an actual schedule. So, okay, so who is Michael Vlahos? So Vlahos is an academic who's worked in the defense business. He got his PhD in 1981, so while I was in high school. He's worked at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He worked at the Center for Naval Analysis. I don't think that we overlapped there, although he might have been like a senior fellow or something. In any event, I never met him there at all. We both were at the Naval War College at the same time, but he was an adjunct faculty someplace else. I think maybe down in the DC area, but I can't remember exactly where he was. Maybe in Baltimore, actually, or at Johns Hopkins at the time. And so the upshot is that I never ran into him at all while I was on the faculty of the Naval War College. He worked at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, which is basically a contractor, a defense contractor. They're what's known as a UARC, a university-affiliated research center. So think nonprofit academic think tank, and you kind of got most of that. Work for the State Department, et cetera. He's got a reputation of being smart, but very smart, but kind of quirky. And I saw this firsthand because even though we drew paychecks from the same organization, and on one occasion and maybe even two different occasions at the same time, the one and only time I've met him in person was when I was in graduate school at the University of Maryland, and he came and was on this panel in the student lounge at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Maryland. And he gave this really, really, really interesting talk that the other panelists were just sort of like, huh? It included things like attacking our enemies by dropping genetically engineered bacteria on them that will dissolve the asphalt in their roads. Yeah, Peter's a little far away from his camera, but I can tell that he's got the look that a lot of other people
So
got.
he's known for war crimes in the making. This is what we're talking about, right?
This was in the context of, if you dissolve the roads, you can beat them without having to kill them.
He's not wrong, but also that affects civilian infrastructure. Therefore, it falls under the Geneva and Hague Conventions.
Well,
just a reminder, guys.
Yeah, but I think I have to actually kill the civilians for it to count. No,
it doesn't. If you hamper their ability to survive in any way, it also counts as a war crime. Because if it makes it so that they cannot survive, if it's torturous in any way, it can fall under those.
I think that would, okay, roger that. So in any event, quirky guy. And so he wrote this quirky article. So first of all, I want to talk about capital ships a little bit. Like just what I think of when I think of a capital ship. And so I think of a capital ship as a ship you build your tactics around. And you may recall that I talked back when I was doing Trent Hone and all the other naval theorist type stuff. I talked about Harris Lanning, the president of the War College, who wrote that article called The Naval Battle. That essay from 1932, 1933, that time period, where he talked about how gave the reasons why guns are sort of the decisive weapon, why guns are more important than torpedoes, and then talked about how you have to build your tactics around the gun line. Your tactics are about optimizing your gun line and sub-optimizing the other guy's gun line. And so when you're talking about the gun line, you're talking about battleships and battle cruisers, and hence you're talking about capital ships. So these are the ships that you expect to win battles, etc. The ships always end up being very expensive, and so I think you end up with a small fleet, not a large fleet. In fact, in the entire history of dreadnought battleships, according to Vallejos's article, and I haven't independently confirmed this, but I have no reason to think it's false, there was only 177 dreadnoughts made in the approximately 50 years of the dreadnought era. 50 years, 40 years of the dreadnought era, throughout the entire world. That's all countries. So, and there aren't very many of these things when they go around. And I also think that, but there has to be more than one, I would argue. So I would argue that the Death Star is not a capital ship, because the Death Star, if that's your standard of capital ship, then there is no other capital ship. And yeah, okay, I guess the Empire was going to build its tactics, or at least it was going to build its strategy around the Death Star, but it wasn't really going to build its tactics around the Death Star. The tactical plan was still based around Star Destroyers. And so I think these ships always end up being the ships that you use to measure your power, right? That's the thing you count. How many, we have 30 dreadnoughts, they have 15, we're winning, that sort of stuff. So, Peter, any thoughts so far?
Not based on the articles. I had a couple of little notes. I'm not sure if they fit in here right now, but I'll throw them out anyways.
Okay.
Capital ships are not used to show the flag when you're trying to you're trying to make a small point. If you don't send a battleship into a neutral or potential hostile, future hostility point. So you wouldn't send battleships to visit Tokyo prior to World War II without major diplomatic prep. I'm thinking corvettes where you send cruisers and destroyers in as your show the flagships all over the place. I think it's corvette.
Yeah, and the other piece of that with corvette in that time period is battleships were way more effective as part of a battle line. So sending a single battleship, it's got a lot of gunpowder, etc., but it wasn't the decisive force that that a squadron of battleships are, multiple squadrons of battleships. In fact, that's one of the things that they talk about, is that it really doesn't count until you have at least 4 of them. 3 or 4. I mean, I think we had squadrons of 3, if I remember correctly. But I believe the Brits had squadrons of 4. I need to double check that at some point.
Yeah, and then I think a point we were talking earlier, national prestige, various.
Yeah.
Even before World War I, there were, I guess, second tier powers. Argentina, Brazil, they all bought battleships.
Yeah, Brazil bought the biggest battleship in the world that had way more turrets, etc. Dreadnought style battleship. They ordered it from the Brits and then couldn't pay for it, but that worked out okay anyway, because the Brits decided that they wanted the ship anyway for World War I purposes. And so they had this one ship that had more guns than any of their other ships did. And if I remember correctly, they concluded that the extra guns didn't help. The extra guns actually caused some problems. So, I also make the observation about capital ships is that because it's a fuzzy term, it's kind of sometimes relative. And so if you think in terms of right now, Vlahos would argue that the current capital ships are aircraft carriers. And so if you think in terms of if it's not an aircraft carrier, it's not a capital ship, you would say that the Germans have no capital ships. But they do have a ship that's the biggest in their navy. They have some destroyers, if I remember correctly. And so the Germans might actually say, hey, our capital ships are our destroyers. Those are our prestige ships, because destroyers aren't as prevalent as they used to be. Now, when we say destroyer, we're not talking about the same thing that they're talking about, that, like a World War I destroyer. Let's see. What else do I have to say about that? I don't think I have anything else to say about that. So I think I'm going to move on. So Vlahos's definition of a capital ship involves some core components, what he calls core components. And this is exactly how it's pronounced, how it was written. It had I added the italics, but it had the in capital letters like that. The highest state-of-the-art weapons technology. So it requires a very sophisticated manufacturing plant in order to make the greatest deliverable weapons payloads. So they've got a lot of power, and that gets interesting when you start talking about treaties and building small stuff as compensating factors, etc. The greatest endurance, the greatest strategic mobility. And so, big ships can have big coal bunkers. And so dreadnoughts could deploy long distances, and that's the sort of thing he's talking about. And the greatest staying power, meaning it's hard to bring one of these guys down. And so, Cosmo Flanker points out that it was HMS Agincourt was what the Brits ended up calling it, and it had 7 turrets, and it was just out of control. So Vlahos talks about these core components of a capital ship as sort of so whatever fits is what he's in these categories for the time periods that he's looking at. That's what he defines as being a capital ship. And he does talk a little bit about how like we include our ballistic missile submarines as being capital ships, sort of like when we of the government of the United States talk about these things. But other people wouldn't necessarily include submarines. And occasionally you see articles, I saw them all throughout my academic and professional career, where people will say, well, the new capital ship is X. The new capital ships are attack submarines. It's like, okay, maybe. I mean, they're certainly expensive enough to be capital ships. But I'm not, if that's what you need. Now, to the best of my knowledge, capital ship is not a term that we ever hear in Star Trek. Do you remember ever hearing it in Star Trek?
No, I don't.
Does David use it in the Honorverse? He talks about battleships and battle cruisers and dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts and super duper dreadnoughts and super duper duper dreadnoughts. But does he talk about, does he ever use the term capital ship?
No, there's the wall of battle ships.
Yeah.
And there's another term for heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. It's not escorts.
Okay.
But
I
he
need
does.
to go back and reread.
Yeah, but he does make mention that there's, especially with after they get Talbot and Silesia, especially after they get the Grand Alliance and the Solarian League starts falling apart, the realization that they need a lot more smaller ships, ones that can defend themselves, deploy long distance. They need presence.
They need cruisers.
Yeah.
That's really the role that cruisers used to fulfill. And the thing about in the Honorverse, when they're fighting the Solarians, they've got such a technological advantage fighting the Solarians that if I had to choose between being in a Manticoran heavy cruiser or a Solarian dreadnought, super dreadnought, I'd rather be in a Manticoran heavy cruiser.
Yeah.
You're more likely to come out of it because the Manticorans had both range and targeting on you. It was really pretty impressive in that regard. But I need to go back and double check all that. It's been a long time since I've read the Honorverse, and I need to get spun back up on it because I'm probably going to do a little bit more thinking about the Honorverse as the timeline moves forward. So, okay, so let me flip forward. So there's this weird sidebar. It's worth pointing out in this article. This is the one part of this article where I sort of went, I can't make this work. So he says only 8 states in the industrial world were capable of or willing to build modern ocean-going ships at the turn of the 20th century. In 1979, there's only 7 states capable of building aircraft carriers in their planes, and it's the same states with the exception that Austria-Hungary is gone. So, okay, so let's lock in on 1979 for an instance, and let's lock in on World War I first and try to figure out what those 8 states were. I can only get to 7. Wikipedia can only get to 7. So I don't know what the 8th state was supposed to be. Am I missing anybody there?
Austria, Hungary, Germany. Turkey, Ottoman Empire, pre-World War One.
I don't think so.
I
don't think they had any dreadnoughts. Well, I think they bought
I'll double check. I'll be right back. Google is our.
Yeah. So I Googled earlier, and there's other people that had dreadnoughts, but they didn't build them themselves. And like the Turks did not build their own ships like that.
All right. Well, let me see what World of Warships has.
You know what? Oh, thank you, Bob. I missed the obvious one, which is Germany. Duh. Okay. Thank you. That was just a total and complete brain fart on my part. How could I miss Germany?
100% would definitely be Germany. I don't see it on that list.
Yep. It's Germany. Yeah. It's Germany. Sorry about that. Okay, so
we figured it out.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah, it was Germany. So
also, Chris, to answer, because the reason I popped out was one, Robert was talking behind me. Two, I was digging. So actually, under the current Geneva Conventions, the reason why they gave him the weird look is because he was suggested an actual war crime. Under the 1977 additions to the Geneva Conventions, that is Article 35. No, he suggested a war crime on a panel. That's why he got the face looks.
So in any event, all right. So add Germany to that list. And I sort of broke it down looking at today who could build a catapult-equipped aircraft carrier. And there are 4 states that I think that can build catapult-equipped aircraft carriers. And and you know what? The list on the right is wrong too. Under Stobar carriers, I forgot India. India should be under there. So I got a lot of changes to make on this slide. But China is now capable of building catapult-equipped aircraft carriers. And probably Russia is too. I'm not sure they quite have the physical plant for it. The Chinese could turn the key on it, but I don't think the Russians can. The Russians would, the catapult side of that, they might have to actually, the catapult's a limiting factor for them, because catapults are surprisingly hard. And they might not be able to turn the key on it just yet. So. Okay, so
right. Well, Russia's got all sorts of other problems at the moment, and it'd be another generation before they can get a blue water navy back.
Yeah, especially once the Ukrainians take Moscow.
Yeah. I was going to say the Black Sea is pretty much a. There's not a lot left there, I think. For infrastructure.
I want to meet the Ukrainian who came up with the idea of declaring the undersea wreck of the Moskva as being a Ukrainian underwater cultural heritage site.
Have you guys seen the thing it's bordering on a war crime, but it's not technically a war crime yet? They're taking essentially rations that were sent to him by this, I think it's the Swedes. It's fermented fish, right? Fermented canned fish. And what they've done is they hate the smell. Everyone hates the smell except for the people that normally eat it. It's an acquired taste kind of thing. So what they have done is they have added munitions onto the can, and they're hanging them from drones, going over atop the Russians, exploding the munition over top of them, and just stinking up. They're making a stink bomb. That's all they're doing. It's a stink bomb. High-tech stink bomb.
So Dale Simpson asked the question, would I define a capital ship by tonnage or by capability? That's a really good question. And I think, there's no real official definition, although I forgot to include on this slide, I really should have included on the slide, is the fact that capital ship actually does have official definitions in some of the treaties. So all those naval treaties of the 20s and 30s, they define what a capital ship is, as does the Montreux Convention, which is the treaty that governs what the Turks will let the Russians send in through the out of the Black Sea into the Med. And so I think in that regard, you know, I think I would define at some level the question about whether you define it by tonnage or by capability is sidestepped by the fact that tonnage and capability are not uncorrelated variables. So the bigger ships are more capable. In fact, one of the things that was really, really, really hit home from doing all the reading on the LCS stuff, and I'm looking forward to Chris Carlson coming back from Iceland and him and me being able to finish the LCS series, is that there's just some things where it's like when you do the math, it's like, yeah, that ship's going to be at least 4,000 tons. This is for LCS. It's like the capability that you want will not fit on a smaller ship. It just can't fit. And so with battleships, they have to be big because they're carrying a lot of armor. They have to have, even the slow ones had huge engineering plants. They're carrying really big guns, and you need, you know, the mounts of the guns are heavy. You need a heavy ship to be able to support all the weight. You need a heavy ship to be able to survive firing. There's
also,
go ahead.
Also deep magazines.
Yeah, deep magazines. When you add all that stuff up. Yeah, that's possibly the case. Although I think at some level I kind of go back to, I think, in my own personal definition, capital ships are about their strategic effect is in winning battles, and so their strategic effect is the application of tactical capabilities, whereas a lot of the things in Star Wars are just about blowing shit up at a strategic level. But I am hardly familiar with all the Star Wars corpus, so. So in any event, the term capital ship itself goes back to the first Anglo-Dutch War in 1652. And for a long time, like for a couple of 100 years, it really just meant a ship that could stand in the line of battle. So if you go back to the British system had several different sets of rates. You'd have a first rate or a second rate or a third rate, and frigates were fifth rate, if I remember correctly. So the first four rates were all ships that would be considered capital ships under this definition because they could stand in the line of battle. You didn't put frigates in the line of battle. So frigates were fifth rate, and then everything else that's smaller than frigates were like sixth rate, if I remember correctly.
Or unrated.
Or unrated. And so, you know, frigates were good as commerce raiders. Corvettes and those other things were really sort of specialist ships. But those other ones could stand in the line of battle. And anybody who's played an Age of Sail naval war game, like Close Action or something like that, understands the idea that, you know, there's always this temptation when you're a new player to put your frigate in the line of battle because you got this extra ship. And don't do it. Just don't do it. It is a hole in your line. It does not have very much capability. The guns are small, so they don't have range, so it's just not worth it. So, but sometimes during the machine age, by 1889, that had changed. And so, why did I pick that date? Why the 1880s as opposed to earlier? Well, this is the part where I call I just came up with this term, the revolution before the revolution. So it's the changes that take place between the Age of Sail and HMS Dreadnought. And by the end of that time period, you know, the 1880s, late 1880s, what you've got is you've gone from iron to steel. You've gone from you now have a strategic use of steam propulsion. So there was a time period where you had these weird ships that had steam engines and sails. And the reason why you had steam engines and sails is because the ships were small enough and the engines were inefficient enough that you could never carry enough coal to do something like cross an ocean with it. So you turned on your steam engine when you needed to steam around and fight a battle, but you got to the battle by putting sail on. But by the time that like the late 1880s roll around, between ships getting bigger, engines getting more efficient, and taking over a bunch of places and putting coaling stations there, you now have strategic use of steam propulsion. So steam propulsion for strategic mobility. And you've also sort of gone for turret weapons, vice broadsides. Now, you look at some of the ships, and we'll see one in just a second. You look at some of those ships and you go, yeah, there's still an awful lot of things that kind of look like broadsides there, but they're all pivot guns. So they have a wider field of fire, and your main weapons are put in turrets because you can put a bigger weapon on the center line, and you get to use it all the time, which is pretty cool. And they were distinct emblems of national power and prestige in a way that sailing ships weren't usually. There was exceptions to that rule. Like every now and then, some king would decide that they were going to build the biggest sailing ship in the world for their navy, to just sort of prove that that they had the cojones to do that. But
hopefully it didn't sink as it was coming out of harbor.
Yeah, like the Mary Rose. The Mary Rose got like 1,500 yards before it sank, something like that. It was tiny, a very short distance. But so like the Royal Navy, what made the Royal Navy special was the quality of the sailors and the number of ships it had. But any individual sailing ship was, it was the symbol of the nation, but you didn't look at that and go like, oh my God, look at that ship, right? They were cool, but they weren't like, they weren't the symbol of prestige in the same way that these sailing ships are, or in the same way that these modern ships are. They were all really, really expensive. So, and one could sort of infer that there are things like this in Star Trek, like, Excelsior class ships, I'm sure caught everybody's attention, and the Constitution class ships. But, the Starfleet just generally doesn't think in these terms. The Klingons seem to think in these terms, right? You get the impression that some of the, at least in some of the Fanon designs, the semi-canon stuff, like the Fossa stuff, that they were just really into, the Klingons were just really into building big stuff when they built battleships. But
the original Starfleet Technical Manual from when we were teens, I think had battleships in there.
Had a dreadnought.
Yeah, but I suspect that was more of, well, we're just going to mimic all the pre-World War II classes.
Yeah.
They except they didn't have anything like aircraft carriers, I don't think.
No, not at that point. Although you did have some indications that they could, the thing that carried the big cargo tubes could have one that would have, I think there was a mention of one that would carry a bunch of shuttles. But, I always thought that heavy cruiser was an interesting designation for the Enterprise in that regard. And I think you can make an argument that cruiser was more about cruising around than some of the implications that you have from cruiser in a regular Navy. Because I really think that Starfleet is closer to the Coast Guard than it is to the US Navy. So
it should have been the high endurance cutter.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, and you get to that when, you've seen all the shows where Pat and I would talk about exploration ships and stuff. What makes an explorer an explorer? And I can tell a pretty good story in that regard about what would make an explorer an explorer. How much of that is canon? I don't know. I kind of think that I'm using the dowsing rod to sort of detect what's going on behind the scenes a little bit, I think. I'd love to have a conversation, and thanks to Wright, I may get the opportunity to at some point. I'd love to have in fact, I should probably just send him an email. I'd love to have a conversation with Rick Sternbach about that. But it's the sort of conversation that I don't think works as well with an email, but might work well sitting down at a bar someplace. So hopefully at some point I'll get an opportunity to do that. Okay, so let me move on. So if you look at this thing, this is the HMS Royal Sovereign, and it is about 15,000 tons, and it's got 4 guns and turrets. And when you compare that to a ship from 30 years later, it's less than half the size, and it's got less than half as many guns. This is the thing where I said the illustration will show guns on the side that sort of kind of look like it might be like a broadside, but all those things pivot, right? They're all casemate guns, and they pivot. Then by the time the 1970s rolls around, you're talking about 100,000 tons with 80 to 100 aircraft. And so that's sort of the theme is capital ships just kept on getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more capability and a greater degree of national wealth tied up within them because they're a lot more expensive over time. So,
yeah, would be interesting to have seen what would have happened in sort of an alternate history if we had never developed the jet engine, the turbine, the gas turbine.
Yeah, well, okay, so here's a slightly tweaky way of thinking about it. What if they decided that axial flow engines didn't work and you were limited to centrifugal flow engines? And so centrifugal flow is I think that the only centrifugal flow jet engines out there these days, jet turbines out there are, I want to say that like you can make really, really small ones. So maybe cruise missiles. I think I remember reading somewhere that there's a couple of missiles that use centrifugal flow engines. The difference between the two, what you think of as being a standard jet engine, what most people think of as being a standard jet engine is specifically an axial flow jet engine. But it requires you to build those turbines. An axial flow engine requires a huge amount of precise engineering and precise metallurgy with regard to the turbines. Centrifugal flow actually has the thrust come out in a different way, sort of out around the sides, and you can build like a disc, I think is how it works. And they're inherently not as efficient. And you can't develop them as far, but they're easier to build. And that's the reason why the Germans get credit for the first jet fighter. They didn't have the first jet fighter. The Brits deployed their jet fighter like a year earlier, and that was the Gloucester Meteor. The Meteor had centrifugal flow engines, and the 262 had axial flow, and the axial flow engines have better performance. Now, Frank Whipple, the designer of that centrifugal flow engine, knew that the axial flow engines could have theoretically better performance, but he was trying to build an airplane during a war. And so he chose the technology that he knew had a greater chance of success, even though he knew that in the long run, it was a dead end. So, interesting fun fact about jet engines. Have you worked on any ships that had gas turbines?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
The only two things I haven't worked on are steam reciprocating and nuclear.
Okay.
And the union I work through, we lost the contract for the Savannah before I was able to get on board and actually get a discharge saying NS.
We still need to figure out how to get on the Savannah.
Yeah, it's a matter of timing. You know, they do tours,
Yeah,
but it's a matter of finding out when they're doing it. And hopefully the Savannah Association will get ownership of the ship as an actual museum. And then it's just a matter of they'll be able to publish. They won't have to go through MARAD for hey, what can we do? What can we have happen? Things like that.
Yeah,
So,
that would be cool.
yes.
I really want to see that.
Yeah.
Really want to see that. One of these days.
Yeah, one of these days. Just like I want to get, there's 3 or 4 steam recip ships still in service. and I want to get on one of those.
Why are there still reciprocating steamships in service?
The Brown and the O'Brien, which are the museum ships, the old Liberties,
Okay.
technically in service.
Okay.
Because they're still Coast Guard and ABS inspected. And the Beaver up in the Great Lakes. It's a car ferry.
Okay.
They just never repowered it. I mean, she's diesel fired steam, not coal fired anymore. But why build something to replace something that's still perfectly working well?
How common is diesel fired steam? I've never heard of diesel fired steam before.
Oh,
I mean, it's kerosene, it burns.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I don't think they're burning Bunker C up there. I don't know. They may be. So technically it wouldn't be diesel. All the US NS ships that were still steamships from the 90s at least were diesel. It's part of the U.S. Navies, or even the battleships were diesel.
The battleships were diesel. They weren't Bunker C.
Not in the 80s.
Wow.
When they went single fuel for the military.
Okay. So they were. So I guess it was DFM.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Expensive, but otherwise you got to have a dedicated set of tankers designed to handle Bunker C.
Do they get a better performance out of DFM over Bunker C?
Other way around. You get more horsepower per volume or per mass out of Bunker C. Just higher energy density.
Okay.
But the support system and how you handle it, it's messy at times. If you know.
Yeah.
So.
Well, fuel in general is messy.
Yeah. Well, Bunker C, or anything similar, is more like tar in some ways, or grease.
Yeah.
So it gets, if you have a drip or a spill inside the ship, that, mind you, inside, you're breaking apart a fuel line or something, it's just that much harder to clean up.
Well, you know what would be worse? Antimatter.
Yeah. Yeah.
So be thankful you don't use antimatter. So, okay, so Vlahos presents the following structure, and this is really what he builds this article around. And he doesn't follow one example. He basically goes through each of these steps, but does it through all three examples. So he presents this nice chart that has these things on the left, and then the 1890s, the 1920s, the 1970s in columns, but he doesn't actually do it that way. He does it by lines, not by columns. So he never picks an example and goes all the way through. But he talks about the capital ship as the platform. So, okay, well, here's what the capital ship is. And this is the thing that he's noticed that happens in all of the cases, right? You've got the capital ship, and then somebody comes along and says, I got this thing that can kill the capital ship. And the public has a tendency to go, the capital ship is dead. But the professionals are like, no, there's more to it than that, right? And then they start compensating for the issue, because there is an issue there. And so you can compensate through doctrinal or there's a doctrinal challenge to I'm skipping a step. Doctrinal challenge to the capital ship at that point. So we should do things differently instead of the capital ship. And then people start talking about alternative platforms and doctrinal responses and tech improvements, and you eventually end up with something that there's a resolution to the debate, and then sometimes it ends up getting tested in combat. Sometimes it doesn't. So I can't really do this part justice without doing like a solid hour on nothing but the stuff on this slide, and so I decided not to try to go through it all, but I did want to look at a couple of highlights in here. So in terms of alternate platforms, he talks about this is the way that you can have alternative platforms. You can make the platform larger frequently to add gear in order to compensate for whatever the threat is. Like for instance, if you think you're going to be attacked with torpedoes, right? There's this torpedo threat. That's the panacea weapon. There's a torpedo threat. Note, for the first 75 years, torpedoes were like next to impossible to hit anything with. But okay, we got torpedoes. We've talked a lot about torpedoes on the show. You can make the platform larger and put in torpedo bulges and put in guns to shoot at torpedo boats and stuff like that. So you can enlarge the traditional platform. Or maybe you break it into smaller pieces and you have more of them. So that was actually proposed by at one point, one of the British, one of the Royal Navy senior admirals, in fact, he may have been the first Sea Lord, proposed during the treaty era that rather than building 35,000-ton battleships, let's build 7,000-ton battleships and build a whole bunch of them. The treaty ended up actually preventing that, and so they never went down that path. But the idea was like, look, a 35,000-ton ship doesn't really give me what I want anyway, so let's go in the other direction. You can try doing hybrid platforms. This is, you saw battleship aircraft carrier hybrids. Yeah, they don't really work as well. You can just sort of say, okay, I'm gonna build something totally new. And, that's kind of what ended up happening with aircraft carriers replacing battleships in the end. Or you can just sort of abandon the idea. I don't know, capital shift there. I meant capital ship. Abandon of the capital ship platform. So those are some of your alternatives. So about antimatter, Michael Boretsky said self-cleaning and that there's no ship to clean after the leak. That's a good point. So he talks about responses, doctrinal responses. And so like one of them is just to adopt the threat weapon yourself. Like, and that's what ended up happening with destroyers, right? We built destroyers. I spent a lot of time talking about that when I talked about Karl Lautenschlager and the evolution of the battle fleet. We built destroyers with the intent that the destroyers would go out and kill the torpedo boats, and then they adopted the torpedo themselves. And so we stopped the threat of the torpedo boat by creating a new ship, but we also adopted the torpedo in the process. Or sometimes it's just you improve the platform in general. Like we started adding torpedo defenses, and they took up mass, and they required space, and et cetera, et cetera. They required some depth there, but we just started building torpedo defenses into our ships to respond to the threat of the torpedo. You see a lot with changing armor schemes over time, right? The armor patterns on a World War I dreadnought were totally different than the armor patterns on a World War II era dreadnought, 1930s era. And that's because airplanes, but to a much greater degree, plunging fire range had increased so much that you had to deal with plunging fire. And that was an issue. And so you needed to armor the top before you could largely get away with armoring the sides. The top wasn't as big a deal. Now you had to start armoring the top. So this might actually be my last slide. Wanted to talk a little bit about the French because this pulls from a bunch of different places in this article to sort of tell this little story about the French. So the French adopted the Jeune École, which stands for young school, right? It's the Young Turks. They came up with this idea that focused on torpedo boats for defending France. And I said anti-commerce rating. That should actually say commerce rating. Commerce rating for attacking the opponent, which was, of course, presumed to be Britain because because they're French and it's always Britain back in this day and age. And so you go on the offense by commerce rating, and you go on the defense with torpedo boats to protect France itself. And so this French Admiral Théophile Albé becomes Minister of Marine in 1886. And immediately the new administration does not approve any battleships for 1886 or 1887. And so there's a year timeline there. So no new battleships are laid down in 87 or 88 because they canceled. They basically said, we're not going to build battleships. We're going to build torpedo boats. So they built a bunch of torpedo boats, right? And I gave you an example previously about what some of those torpedo boats look like, right? And then in the summer of 1887, he wants to show what the Junicole can do, what these torpedo boats can do. So he sends a flotilla of torpedo boats to go attack the French fleet in these exercises. They're going to go down, do an at-sea passage, and go and attack the French fleet at anchor. So of the 22 he sends, 17 don't make it. 7 have mechanical problems. 10 of them just couldn't make it through the seaway. The seas were too strong for them. And they didn't have proper sea keeping. There were only 5 out of the 27 made it to where the battleships were. And they conducted their attack and they had no success. Now, I don't know if they were actually firing like dud torpedoes or whether they were just trying to get close or what. There were no details that I've been able to find on exactly how this took place. There's a book that I'm sure has the details in it, but I don't own it. But 5 made the attack and they weren't successful. At which point, France said, maybe this Junicole stuff isn't working, and they started authorizing battleships again. They started building them.
Sounds a little bit like the opening scene in On Basilisk Station, where with the grav lance to prove.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that's where David got that in part.
Could be. It could be. David is very, very well read about these things, and especially early on in the Honorverse was actively trying to, shall we say, rhyme with history.
Yeah.
That became less prevalent as he invented new stuff. But early on, especially, he was trying to be along those lines. So that wouldn't surprise me. I've never asked him about that. I probably should.
Yeah. Yeah. Make a decent. I wonder if there's a decent set of panels for a sci-fi convention there someplace. You know, where are you getting some of your ideas? But how do you turn that into a decent panel, as opposed to a couple of us quirky people asking a series of quirky questions to a group of authors?
I have a couple of ideas about that. One is that there's actually an online con called Continual. And so they may actually be a good place to go to see about doing, like, creating a track. Continual is a continual con. They just occasionally have panels or something. Or the other thing is, you know, maybe the idea is that I can host it on this show.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be interesting to get David on.
Yeah. And David has been busy enough.
Yeah.
And I don't just mean writing books. I mean, David has had an awful lot of life happen to him over the course of the last few years. And so I have been hesitant to even broach the subject with him. But, you know, I might be able to get Tom Pope, should be easier to get, and maybe, you know, some other BuNine members, and we can potentially pull some other people into it too. So I've got some ideas along those lines. I am beginning to think more and more on this show. That was my last slide. So let's go back to that mode. Actually, that mode. I am thinking more and more about what I want to do with the show going forward. And early on, my thinking on that was basically along the lines of I wasn't thinking about marketing. I wasn't thinking about those things. I was just basically thinking about creating content, because I view everything I do on this show as being sort of a rough draft of something that I could then redo later and represent on YouTube later. And so from that standpoint, thank you once again, everybody, for spending your Saturday night with me. I appreciate it, because you're my sort of test audience for a bunch of this stuff. And a lot of times, you know, I do it in front of this live audience, and I learn stuff about how to think about it. And it's sort of it's always different when you do a presentation for real. Even though I can't see any of you, I know that you're there, and it feels like it's for real, and so it becomes a little bit different in terms of the approach. So I'm now at the point where I'm beginning to think about, like, what does things look like going forward. And I don't have a set plan yet. I've got some ideas. Need to talk over a few things with Alec to just sort of figure it out, how to make it work going forward. I don't have any plans to do anything with this show that isn't along the lines of bringing more guests on, maybe having a little bit more structure, etc. But I'm not planning on replacing the show or anything like that. I'm thinking about in addition to, not instead of. And so Bob points out that some of you could be AIs, but you are clever and discerning AIs, and I, for one, welcome our AI overlords. Wright points out that John Parshall might be an interesting guest. Yeah, in fact, I've talked with him about being on the show, and I just need to get my act together. He's more than willing to be on the show. Well, his first reaction was like, you know that I'm a historian, right? And I said, yeah, you're a historian that everybody on my show, everybody in the audience of my show has read. And I spent, this episode was a really good example. We were mostly talking about the real world. We weren't talking about science fiction, because I always tell people that my fandom superpower is that I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. And frequently I spend more time talking about the real world stuff when I find something interesting in the real world. And so, yeah, it's like, John, come on the show. I can handle the science fiction side of things. John can talk about things like, doctrine. I want to have Trent Hone on the show too, right? And talk with him about the importance of doctrine and all that other stuff that goes along with it. Because I think that's the thing that makes things like that, are what makes science fiction better, right? That's one of the reasons why I love the Honorverse so much, is because it's got enough elements of the real world. It isn't just about, I've got the super duper antimatter weapon. Oh, they built a bigger Death Star. Oh, now the Death Star is a planet. That sort of stuff. It's like, sometimes that's fine cinema, but it's not about the technological solution. It's about how you put it all together and the details in that matter. I'm a lot more interested these days in doctrine than I am in hardware. I used to be a hardware guy. I'm now much more interested in doctrine, because I know that that's how important the command and control stuff is on making all this stuff work. One of my professors at the War College, so he was a colleague by day, professor by night sort of deal, right? He was an officer in the Royal Navy, and showed up in the Falklands for the tail end of the Falklands War. He got down there late because they were converting the vessel that he was in to be a minesweeper. And then, but as they're doing the conversion and stuff like that, his CO was constantly saying, was very interested in the chain of command, was very interested in the organizational structure of the force. And this young lieutenant didn't understand why. And finally, his commanding officer sort of explained it to him. He said, look, I'm not worried about the skill of the people involved, etc. If you get the chain of command right, if you get the organizational structure right, All the other problems will take care of themselves. But the thing I'm most worried about is something falling through the cracks. And I totally get that. I totally get that. Right? I've seen a lot of stuff fall through the cracks because it was nobody's job to do it. And it came back to bite people later on. So. Okay, let me take one last look at the questions and see if there's anything that's jumping out. So Logic's Finest said, I thought all current naval warships are diesel, electric, gas turbine, or nuclear. I think that's actually true for the warships, although the nuclear ships get, the nuclear ships are steamships in that the steam is just made by a hot rock as opposed to burning a liquid. But some of the support ships, the non-combatants, would-be non-combatants, everybody gets to be a combatant if you're in a war zone, would-be non-combatants they would still have some steamships for things like that. Although am I correct that they're mostly gone now? Do we have any steam? Are the Oilers still steamships? Do you remember?
No, Oilers have been peel sticks since the 80s.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the Fleet Oilers. Then the old Cirrus class were slow speeds.
Okay.
So, I can't remember which brand, which I really shouldn't remember because I was on one. And then the two hospital ships, I believe, are steam.
Okay.
Yeah, the Comfort and the Mercy are steamships. One of the amphib classes may still be steam, but not very many.
Wright says that Blue Ridge and Mount Whitney are steamships.
Oh God, yeah, they're ancient.
Yeah, and I think the amphibs at this point, I think most of the amphibs are. I'm not sure there are any old amphibs anymore. I think they've been trying to cycle through those. I don't pay as much attention to amphibs as and I'm not working for, when I went off to DIA, I became a lot more concerned with red than blue. And to the degree I was concerned with blue, it was primarily submarines. So I've kind of lost lock on a bunch of this stuff. And now that I don't work at DIA and I'm not, my job description does not have Navy in it anywhere these days. And so as a result of that, I don't have as good a feel for that.
Yeah. A lot of the sea lift ships are still steam, and that's causing problems.
Yeah.
Just finding people that know how to run them is a challenge.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, they're. I was watching one of the. I was away for 2 months at sea, and I was been catching up on some of the older episodes. Chris Carlson was talking about the distiller that one of the ships he was on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're starting to rip those out because we can't find people that know how to operate them.
And they're replacing them with reverse osmosis?
No, they're replacing them with plate style. You pump salt water into it, and you pump jacket water or heated water, running around 190 to 210 degrees,
mm-hmm.
And it boils between a pair of plates, then condenses again to get your fresh water. Real simple. As long as you put it together correctly and you turn it on in the right order, there's nothing to it.
So how does this differ from a distiller?
Well, it's a form of
distilling.
You are distilling. It's the question between flash and plate.
Okay.
Yeah. I'd have to build a presentation and such. So
I'll take your word for it. So okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit too hardware specific probably for the show.
Well, I think I told the story once before, but I'm going to tell it again because we have some people that probably haven't heard it. So I was on board USS Philippine Sea, and Ticonderoga class cruiser, and I asked. I was in the wardroom and I stuck my head into the galley area and asked the sailor there. It's like, do you have any bottled water? And the Chang, the chief engineer, overheard this, and he said, "Oh, so my reverse osmosis water isn't good enough for the civilian, huh?" And I said to him, I said, "Chang, it's not its potability, it's its portability. I'm really interested in the bottle." Because I had a bottle in my rack, and I left it in my rack, and somebody for overnight, and somebody threw it away. Because technically you're not supposed to leave stuff in your rack like that. And they also were a little upset that I wasn't making my rack. And I told them, I said, look, trust me on this. They're not going to penalize you for the civilian not playing along. And I can't make this rack worth shit anyway. Right. So even if I were to make my rack, you'd still fail inspection. So I'm not even going to try. And if you get any shit from the XO, or from anybody, let me know, and I will talk to the XO. I have dinner with him every night. Because he had known, he had worked with some CNA people before. And so when he found out I was a CNA person, he was like right there. And good guy, Bob something. I can't remember his last name now. So in any event, later that day, there was an announcement over the 1MC that they were suspending that they had a contamination in the main water tank, and they were going to have to flush it and decontaminate. And so at dinner that night, the Cheng sort of said, "Oh, I guess I shouldn't give you shit about the water." But the thing is, those plants are so efficient that the comment, one of my fellow CNA colleagues made the comment that he had never met a chief engineer who, if you pressed him, wouldn't admit that he was dumping fresh water overboard.
Yeah, we used to do that. We don't, the ships I'm on currently, we don't anymore.
Well, if you've got the ability to turn it on and off, that's great. But they were just cranking all the time. Now,
they just kept adding more people to the ship.
Oh, okay, I can see that.
Yeah, yeah, we were designed for a certain number of people, and early in the program, when we were operating in certain areas, the idea of what they would refer to as a Hollywood shower, 20 minutes, who cares? Yeah, we still had water overflowing on over the side. We just didn't have that many people on board, and they were so efficient.
There was a trying to remember which ship it was. I think when I was on Constellation. So Constellation is not a nuke, and that changes things, right? So aircraft carriers need a lot of steam, the ones with the older, not the Ford class, but everything before it, because they had steam catapults. So they go through metric shit tons of steam. They don't use salt water for the steam, it's fresh water. And so they had to make lots and lots of fresh water. And on Constellation, there was a sign up that said, if you don't conserve water, we will ration water.
Yeah.
But that's the only ship I've ever seen a sign like that on. On the Nimitz's, no problem. Now, that having been said, I certainly did not abuse the privilege, but on Constellation, when I saw that sign, I did your standard, turn the water off and
yeah.
On the Nimitz's, I would take a fast shower, but I generally leave the water running. About half the time I left the water running. And all those, for those who haven't been on a ship like this, they all have a little switch on the shower head so that you can actually shut the water flow off without having to twist the knobs. And so Wright says that he never worried about making his bunk every single day. On Philippine Sea, apparently the previous CO, now when I got on board, the new CO, Stephen Johnson, had been on for a week. And so I got to watch them learn the new CO. The previous CO had been a bit of a screamer, and he had everybody stirred up. And so they were beginning to decompress after this guy left. But they were kind of stirred up about stuff like that. So, but I did those guys a solid for what it's worth, because at one point I was I was talking with the XO, and he said, "What's it like? You know, how is it living down in the engineering with the engineering crew?" And I said the only issue I think they're running into is that they have a tendency to run out of toilet paper. And he said, aren't they filling up the 5-shooters? Because they had these toilet paper dispensers that could hold 5 rolls of toilet paper. And when you finished a roll of toilet paper, they were just gravity feed. And I said, yeah, the problem is I think they need a 6 or a 7 shooter. So by the end of the day, they were pretty darn close to Winchester on toilet paper. I learned the hard way that I needed to always make sure I had some napkins so I could take care of. So I could be prepared.
Yeah. Napkins can play havoc on sewage systems, though. They don't dissolve very well.
You know what? Then give me some toilet paper.
Yeah. We were actually looking at instituting bag checks because of our sewage system on the ship, and going, yeah, no, you can't. We know you just went out and bought this. You're not allowed to have this on the ship. Thank you. And then pay somebody to take it away. Now, we provide certain chemicals. We provide certain items. You don't like it. You can complain up your chain of command, and then we'll use that as the reason for having an awful lot more spare parts, an awful lot more overtime, and a lot more contractor support.
Yeah.
At which point your chain of command is probably going to, when they start seeing the bills, because you want this one little item, they're going to go, yeah, no, suck it.
Yeah. So life at sea is interesting. I miss it. Last time I was at sea, I'm coming up on the 20-year anniversary of the last time I went to sea. The 20-year anniversary will be around Thanksgiving time. And the last time at sea was aboard USS Vincennes in Japan. It was for Annual X in Japan. So, last time I've been out of the country too. Well, actually, no, I'm sorry. That's not true. I've been to Canada since then. Well,
does that count as out of the country?
If they ask for a passport, it counts.
I went to Canada 120 times, and I never had to show a passport or a driver's license.
9/11.
Yeah, they changed things a lot. they continually change things with Canada depending on our relationship at any given point in time too. And right now, our relationship with Mexico is not that great either. So,
this was a fuel pier in Canada. We'd stop there for a couple hours and just take on bunkers. So.
Okay. Yeah. So I actually drove to Canada to go to I was the U.S. head of delegation for an international conference. And so I was traveling on my red passport. But these days, I don't have any passport because my red one was a DIA passport, so it's gone, and my blue one expired, and I've just never gotten it renewed. So
I haven't renewed my passport since I was a kid.
I should probably do it. We should do it at some point.
Because
Yeah.
I got my passport specifically to go to Germany, and I haven't gotten it since, because if you are underage, once you turn 18, you have to get a new passport. So as soon as I became an adult, I had to get a new passport no matter what, even if it was like within the expiration time. And I just haven't done it since.
Well, I've had to have a passport for a very long time. It's a job requirement. Although,
I would think so.
yeah, although pre 9/11, we had one guy. He got into the UK and left the UK on a New York State driver's license.
Okay.
Look, I can't say anything. When I interacted with the German cops at one point, because we had alcohol, the only ID I had with me that had my birth date on it was my school ID. Because I didn't think about it. I was like, oh yeah, I probably should have brought my passport with me. But
yeah, we were going coastal, and he forgot his passport because he was going up and down the U.S. coast. And then for some reason, he forgot his Merchant Mariner ID back when there were two separate items. He had his license, which was a paper item. He had to show that. And then they said, yep, you're heading to the UK. And he forgot that he didn't have that stuff with him. So it's like, okay, yeah, you're already here on a ship, and the ship is going into the shipyard. Yeah, we have no choice but to let you in. And we have no choice but to let you back into the United States with what you have.
Well, they
could entirely just make him stay on the ship and not set foot on land.
No,
not an option.
Not an option.
They could put him on an airplane like right away, like take him to the airport and say you're being deported.
Fair. That's another option.
Which is basically what we all did. We signed off the ship, and we drove up to London, and they flew us back to New York.
Oh, if that's what you were doing anyway, that's why you got away with it. Because it's like, well, we were going to deport him anyway, and you guys are just going here to... whatever. We're not going to do the paperwork. We're not going to do the paperwork. It's not worth it.
The other alternative is they get to keep him. So...
Yeah.
Right.
But again, I feel like that day depended on that very particular person being like, I don't want to do this paperwork. I don't want the red tape today. Just fucking go. You're going anyway. I don't want to deal with it.
Wright points out that he never had a passport during his active duty time, but of course your active duty ID acts as a passport. So
yeah, that's different.
Yeah. So
our old Merchant Mariner ID used to work that way.
Yeah.
So
I never had I had a Geneva Convention card, but I still needed a passport.
Geneva Convention card.
Yeah, as a civilian going with this is a
you would need to be actively identified as someone who is a non-combatant.
Well, as a guy who's not a spy or a soldier trying to hide out, and especially, it was potentially an issue. So some of the guys at CNA, there was a time period where CNA folks actually dressed in khaki when they went to sea, and they had
reminder because I was looking at the Geneva Convention earlier. Here's a summary of it from the Red Cross. Because conveniently, I have that on hand.
Yeah, so there was one guy when I was still at CNA who was going to sea for the Gulf War, for Iran, for was it OIF or OEF? Well, I think it was OEF actually. Yeah, he went to sea and he was old school. He had a set of khakis with CNA collar tabs. And apparently that's the way that you used to do it. But by the time I went to sea, it's like I had never seen this before. and he showed up at work in it. It's like, what the hell? Never heard of this before. So, but oh well. So we're done. I think it's time to declare victory and go off. And so remember, let me put that. I'm going to put the schedule back.
We have a strategic maple syrup reserve.
So okay. So I'm going to tell
that actually is a real thing, though.
I'm going to tell my Canada story.
Just a reminder that Canada actually has a maple syrup reserve, guys.
They do. So when I went to Canada, there was a couple of funny things that happened. The first one was I got there the first day, and I went to this sidewalk cafe because it was June, and you could eat in the sidewalk in Ottawa in June. And so I went to this restaurant that it was an open area in the restaurant. And when they came up to me, this was before chip cards really hit in the U.S., but the rest of the world had them. And so this was the first time I ever saw the handheld credit card reader. And so he comes up to me, and I go to pay, and he hands me the card, and he goes to stick it in the chip reader. And then he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize this was an American card." At which point he got this total look of panic on his face, because he realized that he had just implied that I might be an American. And if I wasn't an American, I might take offense at that. And I just laughed and said, "It's okay. I am an American. Yes, our banks are backwards." So, yeah. So,
yeah.
Before I got to leave, I had, of course, to buy gifts for everybody. And since, a lifetime supply of poutine does not keep, I decided that the right answer was to buy maple syrup. And there was a convenient sidewalk kiosk sort of thing where you could buy maple syrup. And so I went up to this kiosk to buy maple syrup. And they explained to me that they had two different kinds of maple syrup, and one of them was too good for Americans. Now, being Canadians, they did not say that they were too good for Americans, because that would be rude. What they said was, this is the maple syrup that we export, and this is the maple syrup that we do not export. I
mean, to be fair, if I was the Canadians, I'd be fucking keeping the better maple syrup too.
Yeah, and it was the better stuff. It was the darker stuff.
Yeah, the dark stuff is good. Like, that's why I prefer dark maple syrup. If you get dark maple syrup from the States, like Vermont, that's one of their main exports.
Yeah.
It's love real maple. I will never buy fake syrup on my own. No.
Yeah.
Real honey, real maple syrup. You will never catch me buying the fake shit unless the kids specifically want it.
Yeah. Now the funny thing is that there's a good friend of mine that I'd love to have on the show at some point. And he's from New Hampshire. And when I talk about, when I tell the story about the Canadian maple syrup, he is totally and completely dismissive of Canadian maple syrup. It's like those barbarians in Canada that don't know how to grow maple trees, and don't know how to make their maple syrup is garbage. If you want to get good maple syrup, you have to go to New Hampshire.
See, one of my friends is actively waiting for it to get colder to send me some of the maple candies that their Canadian partner sent them, because we know how hot Georgia is. We don't want these to melt.
I brought back maple candies from my mother, and then I brought back a six pack of cans of maple syrup because they weigh a lot less. So and more durable than glass.
Maple candy is one of my favorite candies. Actually, it is my favorite candy. Absolute favorite candy. And it's just so niche here. Like, you can only get it around like Thanksgiving, Christmas time in Georgia.
Contact me offline. I've got a supplier who does mail order.
Ooh, Peter, you have become one of my better friends. It is like in my family, we fight over the maple candy if we find it here.
Yeah, it's old school. It's old style, so it's a It's a piece probably about that big, solid.
Ooh.
Is your supplier in Massachusetts?
No. She's down in Virginia.
Okay. The reason why I asked that is that from talking with friends of mine from Massachusetts, there is a difference in the grade school experience. In Iowa, you do the field trip to the dairy. In Massachusetts, you do the field trip to go watch them bleed the trees.
That is an accurate description of what they're doing. Ah, yes, ancient tree bleeding.
The town next to where I grew up, high school, you bled the trees.
Yep.
They actually did. They had their own maple syrup production facility.
Oh, that's fucking cool.
On the high school campus.
And it takes like 10,000 gallons of tree sap to get like an ounce of maple syrup.
Oh yeah, no, it's like ridiculous. It's like less than like 10% of what you get out of the syrup. The actual like.
Yeah, it's tiny.
Sap. It like most of it is water. Most of it's going to be water, and so you're going to have to boil that down to actually get it to syrup level.
So. We've got somebody in the
yes, there is fake honey, Alex.
There is fake honey. In fact, like if you go to like Kentucky Fried Chicken or someplace like that, those little packets of honey
that's not real honey. That is like cane syrup.
Yeah,
that they've added a honey flavor into.
Yeah, and I don't know whether the honey flavor is honey or whether it's something else, but yeah. It's,
no, it's essentially the equivalent of like a natural flavor that you would find in like strawberry or something like that.
Okay.
So it's literally just a flavor that they've added to it to make it taste like honey. So yes, there is actually fake honey. There's fake honey, fake corn syrup. Well, you don't really fake Caro usually, but like there's if there is a food version of it that is worth something, there's a fake version of it.
So a quick science fiction piece of this. You may recall that in the John Ringo Troy Rising trilogy, maple syrup is an intoxicant to one of the alien races, and that's how this guy who like worked at a 7-Eleven or something like that becomes the world's richest guy because he figures that out and is able to trade the aliens maple syrup for advanced computer technology, which makes him a billionaire. So then he goes and buys all the maple syrup. And there was a role-playing game. I think this was Iron Crown Enterprises Space Master had a module where there's a group of aliens a race of aliens who find chocolate to be a narcotic. And as it turns out,
I think I remember my dad talking about this series at one point with me.
And as it turns out, there's the sewage that these aliens produce. The aliens' waste products can be processed into a powerful narcotic that humans can take. And so
we trade chocolate for their shit.
Yeah, we trade. So smugglers, it's illegal on both sides, but smugglers will smuggle in chocolate syrup and bring back raw sewage. It was one of the Space Master modules.
The circle of life.
Yeah, and I need to.
That escalated quickly.
Yeah, I need to go back and reread the Space Master stuff because on the one hand, the first time I read through it, it's like it looked like a pastiche of every single different property out there, and it was just like it's a little bit of Dune, a little bit of Traveler, a little bit of this.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how high were they? Were they in the stratosphere when they wrote this?
I don't know, but the guy who was the guy running it is somebody that I've actually met. He went to high school with a good friend of mine, and so at Origins one year we had lunch with him or dinner with him, And the entire time I was in Charlottesville for 8 years, and that's where Iron Crown Enterprise was based. In fact, if you look up Iron Crown Enterprises, the address for it after it sort of fell on hard times, etc., the address was a house in this guy's neighborhood in Charlottesville. I looked it up on Google Maps, so I think it was just Iron Crown Enterprises was Pete Fenlon, and I think he was just running it out of his home. So.
Fair enough.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but that's freaking hilarious. Again, like, it's not unheard of in science fiction for like us to realize, oh, hey, this thing that we would normally be like, oh, that's gross in our context, we find out has this special effect on us, and it's like, oh, well, okay, but if we like sterilize it and then like boil it down, we can turn it into drugs.
The thing that just kind of amazes me is that I don't recall any storylines in any episode of Star Trek that's anything like that. I mean, the part that's amazing to me about Star Trek is that they really did just sort of treat it like it's people with seafood glued to their foreheads. You occasionally ended up with things like Klingon rituals and stuff like that, but you never ended up with anybody just going like, oh, don't make me go to the Andorian side of the station. The Andorians just like stink, right? I mean, there's just nothing like that, and there's nothing like,
Yeah, no, like, so here's the thing about Star Trek. I love Star Trek as a series, but if we're talking about it as like a franchise, it is very sterile compared to other sci-fi.
Yes.
It is a very sterile, very utopian view of science fiction.
Yes.
And that's fine for escapism. But the reality is humans alone have our own quirks when we're dealing with our own species, let alone when we're dealing with species that are nothing like us.
So Bob claims that there's several mentions of how bad humans smell to Vulcans, which means Spock must have.
Yes, they do actually mention that the humans, because Vulcans' nose are so much more sensitive, the pheromones that come off of humans are like very stinky to them. I think if you watch Enterprise, T'Pol actually mentions it a few times. The doctor actively gives her medication for it.
I need to confirm with some of my submariner friends that whether it was still the case when they were in, because they were in much more recently, that you weren't supposed to wear deodorant and stuff like that on submarines.
Yeah, because if someone's allergic to it,
if you're
confined.
If you're allergic to it, you're probably not in the service. But it was just that it was one of those things that was in a closed environment. It had a tendency to build up over time.
Also people can develop allergies without any buildup to it all of a sudden. And if you're in a confined environment, as you just said, it builds up over time.
Yeah, but in that particular case, you're more likely to develop an allergy to a cleaning solution or something else like that.
Fair.
But oh well.
But yeah, they do some world building in regards to that, but like they're definitely not as good about it with Star Trek because of the fact that it has been kind of sterilized.
Yeah. Well, it's its great advantage and its great disadvantage. It is its Greek flaw in that it's the same thing at both times.
Yeah, because again, it's like, hey, Star Trek's supposed to be what we're striving to go towards, but at the same time, you still want the story to have those human elements that we associate with, in order to build a good story, to make a good plot. And so, like, you're playing this tightrope with, okay, well, we want to make them interact with it a little bit more. but we also still have this like utopian society that we're building.
Mm-hmm. So about 20 minutes ago, we were within 15 seconds of ending the show.
We ADHD'd into this topic.
We should probably call it a night.
All right, guys.
So no show next week. No show the week after. Next show on the let me verify the date. Next show is on the 5th of October.
Yes. I'm glad we don't have a show next week because I'm going to my future brother-in-law's wedding. So we have the kids. Hi, Ashley.
That's good. So, all right, everybody. Thank you very much. As always, I appreciate the fact that you all come and spend your Saturday night with me, for those who are watching live. For those who are not watching live or watching it on YouTube later, I appreciate the fact that you do that also. I've never really said like and subscribe and all that other YouTube-y
do
stuff.
The things. Do the excite.
Yeah, do the YouTube-y things. We should probably start trying to do the YouTube-y things.
We probably should on here.
Yeah, we probably should. And so, Peter, thank you very much for joining. We'll have you back on again, of course, at some point. Yep. And look forward to hearing more stories about you traveling the world and more ship stuff. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
And so with that, everybody, have a good week.
Live long and prosper.
Later.